Welcome. My name is Mark Johnson, professor of political science and history at Minnesota State Community and Technical College, and I'm here with Court of Appeals Judge Ralph Erickson. Welcome, Judge.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I wanted to start with, I hear there's an interesting story about the circumstances of your birth.
Well, you know, according to family lore, there really is kind of an interesting story. My recollection is not good, right? But I was born at the end of April in 1959 in Thief River Falls, Minnesota. And as it sometimes happens in the North Country, it was freezing rain, snowing, high winds, near blizzard conditions, and the roads were unpassable. I was born premature at about 6 months, a little under 2 pounds at the time of my birth. When I was born, the doctor handed me off to the nun who was a nurse and who had assisted in my delivery and said, try and make this baby comfortable until he dies. So the nurse had me wrapped in warm blankets, and they kept changing blankets, and a couple hours later, she goes up to the doctor and says, Doc, I don't think this baby is going to die, and you're going to have to figure out what you're going to do to treat him. And at that point, the doctor was faced with a conundrum. He didn't think the roads were passable enough, and given the circumstances, he wasn't about to risk an ambulance crew to take me to Grand Forks, which was the nearest place they could care for me. They had a single isolate incubator type thing at the hospital, and it was already occupied by somebody who on the triage system was far more likely to survive than me. And so he's out in the hallway having a conversation with the nurse and with a couple of other staff people. And there's a janitor there who overhears this conversation. And he says, you know, they got chicken brooders over at the TBA. Now, the TBA is a tires, battery, and farm equipment store. And everybody stops and looks at him and says, what? And he says, you know, a chicken brooder, you know, it's a metal box. It's got light bulbs in it. It keeps things warm. He says, you just like put blankets in there so that child can't hit the light bulbs. It'll keep that baby warm. It keeps chicks warm. And that's how I came to spend the first 2 days of my life in a chicken brooder underneath an oxygen tent, which I do not think is an FDA-approved kind of use for either the brooder or the tent. But I'm still here, so it must have worked.
And we're glad so. Tell me a little about your early life. Parents, siblings, extended family, your schooling up through high school.
Yeah,
what was that like?
Yeah, my dad worked for the ASCS, now the FSA, and so he was a farm administrator. When I was born, at that time, he was actually working in Thief River Falls for a family business that sold Nashes and Ramblers. At some point, that business failed, and he moved to Langdon, where my mother was from. She was a social worker by training. There are 7 children in our family. I have 5 brothers and my sister, who is the oldest. And I grew up in a really interesting family from the standpoint that we had 5 boys over an 8-year period. And so we had a lot of kind of rough and tumble sibling rivalry growing on at all times. But it was just a idyllic life. My dad moved from Langdon, where he was the deputy executive county director, to Rugby, where he became the county director. And then after I graduated from high school at Rugby in 1977, he became a state office employee and moved to Fargo. So I've never lived more than 150 miles from the place I've been born. So it's kind of interesting.
What led to your decision to pursue a legal career? When did you make that decision?
You know, when I was about in the 5th or 4th grade, I started telling everybody I was going to be a lawyer. Now, I really just wanted to be a lawyer because Jack Kennedy was a lawyer, and at that point I thought he was a very inspirational figure and somebody I'd like to emulate. By the time I graduated from high school, I had no idea of being a lawyer. I wanted to be a Phi Ed teacher. I went to college at Jamestown College, now the University of Jamestown. I studied history and biology and philosophy, and I took education courses and was going to be a secondary school teacher. During the course of actually spending time in school, I discovered that they lacked a certain enthusiasm for history that I had, and it was not really all that much fun. And so I graduated with really no skill set, and so I had to do something. And I fell back into, well, I'll go to law school. So that's really the story.
So you mentioned your training in secondary ed. Other than the legal profession, what other types of jobs had you held previously, whether in college or in high school or before going to law school or finishing law school? Any other careers, even temporarily, that you pursued?
Yeah, the first job that I ever had, I got when I was 14 years old. I was the butcher's assistant in a butcher shop. I had to go down and fill out the hazardous work form and get permission from the juvenile judge to take the job. I really got it because I was big enough to lift quarters of beef off of hooks and throw them on a table, and they were looking for some young lad to do that and clean the place up. And so my first job was in a butcher shop, which was really pretty fascinating. I worked as different jobs in grocery stores. I was a produce manager for a while going to school. I stocked shelves, and I worked in the oil fields. I worked for a seismograph company, and I was the bill status reporter and calendar clerk for the North Dakota House of Representatives at a time. I was the last person to hold the job before I was replaced by a computer. So,
Your family, I know you're married, your wife and children. Tell us a little about them.
Yeah, I've been married to my wife, Michelle. It'll be 30 years in December. She's an optometrist. We had kind of an off and on relationship. I met her first when I was in law school. I probably ought to get this out of the way. I'm an alcoholic in recovery. I've been sober for 30 years as well. And that kind of colored my ability to maintain relationships. And it really wasn't until I started to find sobriety and become a mature adult that we were able to maintain a really sound relationship. We have two daughters. The oldest is Hannah, and she's currently working on her master's degree in special education. And my youngest is Elizabeth, and I think she'll be going to law school, but she hasn't really made up her mind yet.
Following Dad's footsteps.
Yeah.
So, other than your parents or maybe other family members, who've been the most important mentors in your life?
I really think there are three people that have been pretty fundamental in my life. The first is Bob Christman. And Bob was my dad's boss at the ASCS as the state director, and has just been a person who, during my adult life, has given me an awful lot of good advice and helped me through a lot of interesting spots. Chief Justice Gerald Vanderwall of the North Dakota Supreme Court has been a pretty formative man in my life, and after my father passed away, he's been something of a father figure to me. Mm-hmm. And then the third person is Norm Bacchus, who was a district judge in the East Central District of North Dakota when I became a state district judge. And an awful lot about what I know about judging I learned from Norman.
Okay. So that's a great transition to asking about your legal career. So after you finished law school, your early career as an attorney, what types of cases, what was your practice like? And are there any a couple of cases perhaps stand out during that early time in your career?
I went to work for a 16-person law firm that had a broad general practice, but mostly did municipal and water law work and some bonding. But because they were a general practice firm, they had a bunch of other stuff that nobody wanted to do. That's what I got to do. So when I first started, I did a lot of divorce work. I prosecuted for the city of West Fargo and for the city of Moorhead for some time. And in addition to that, I had a practice that involved workers' compensation and Social Security claims and a little bit of personal injury work. And so that was kind of what I did. I had some plaintiff's medical malpractice cases that I worked that I was involved in. And so that's kind of the general nature of my practice.
Okay. So in that early career, was being a judge a goal? Was that in the back of your mind, or did that develop later?
I never wanted to be a judge. And, kind of the way that all happened is at one point, the county court in Cass County, North Dakota, which is the county seat is Fargo, they were without a county magistrate, and they needed somebody to handle traffic court mental health court, and small claims court. And I got a call from Judge Frank Rasick, who was at that point the chief county judge. And he called me and he said, I need you to help me out. And I want you to do this for 3 days a week for $17,000. And I said, why would I do that, Frank? I mean, that's crazy. And he said, because you might want to be a judge, and this will give you a chance to know. I said, I don't want to be a judge. There's no way I want to do that. I said, why would you be a referee and can still play the game? And he said, listen to me. He said, Ralph, this is actually a really good job. And I said, thanks, I'm not interested. So he called back a few weeks later and said, I really need you to help me out. You know, the application deadline is going to pass, and so you're going to apply, right? And I said, no, I'm not. A little while later, they posted it, and then I got a call from Norm Bacchus, who was the chief judge for the district, and he said, you know, we need you to help us out. We are not very happy with the people that we have on this applicant list, and you're really the only person that we would trust to do this important work, and, we just want you to help us out. And I said, I'll think about it. At that point, one of those judges called my wife, and I got up on the day that I was supposed to let them know, and Michelle says to me, well, you're going to apply for that job? And I said, well, why? And she said, because if everybody thinks you'd be good at it, you ought to at least try it. And so I thought, okay. I called back Frank Rasick and I said, I'll do it, but I'll only do it for 90 days, and you should list that job immediately because I'm not doing this long term. I took the job, and 2 weeks later, I walked into his office and I said, you know, I kind of like this, and I think I'll keep doing it. Now, I only did that because I knew that all the county judges were going to become district judges, and that was going to open up a number of seats. And I intended at that point to run as a district judge. Well, what happened when I filed is that the sitting county judge resigned so that she could file to be a state's attorney. And then I got appointed as a county judge for a multi-county district. And that's how it came to pass that I served as a county judge, a state district judge, then both on the U.S. District Court and now on the Court of Appeals.
That actually was a great transition into my next question, because I knew you'd served for a while on the county court. I wasn't sure for how long. So when that transition happened, of course, much of this is now lost. I think most people who are around now might not even realize that this transition happened. You, of course, were there during that time. Any observation, even though you only were a county judge for a brief period, what changed? Did anything change? Were there any little bumps or odd things that perhaps went along with that transition?
Not very much in my case, because the county judgeship that I took had always been assigned district court work, which was always possible. So that judge had always been doing district court work and county judge work, but getting paid as a district judge, or as a county judge, about $10,000 less. So what I did is I had the counties that I served were Cass County, Trail County, Steele County, and Nelson County, and Griggs counties. And so basically I spent 1 day a week in Fargo, Hillsborough, Findlay, Cooperstown, and Lakota, and drove the circuit. And actually, looking back on it, that's the best judge's job I ever had. I dealt with a lot of ordinary people with real life problems. I was new, I was enthusiastic, everything was exciting, and I feel like at that point I just had a lot more opportunity to interact with people and improve their lives.
So reflecting back on that time as a state, when you were still a state judge, are there any particular cases? There's one in particular I've heard about, and you mentioned Findlay. Mm-hmm. There's a story that I've heard, I heard it long before I met you, regarding this man poaching up in the Findlay area. And I do want to hear about that case, but I'm curious if there's any others besides that that perhaps stand out during your time as a state district court judge.
Well, you know, I think the one that stands out the most to me is I presided over a case, State versus Barry Garcia, which was kind of the first it was described as a gang-related shooting at a time where no such thing had ever been imagined in the Fargo-Moorhead metropolitan area. a young man who was 17 years old had shot a woman and killed her with a shotgun. She was coming home from a funeral with her husband and a neighbor, and they had driven up to Mr. Garcia and two other young lads who were messing around with a car. He was carrying a shotgun, that being Barry Garcia, and he eventually shot Mrs. Tenderland, and his explanation was that she looked at him the wrong way. And so it was an odd case. It was the first case of that type that was tried in North Dakota. It was broadcast gavel to gavel on KFGO radio, if you can believe that. And they went and hired my former partner, Bob Hoy, to do the color commentary on it. And it was the first murder trial I'd ever tried. I was only 34 years old. It was a strange case. And so I would say that's probably the highest profile case that I ever tried as a state judge. Now, if you look at the case in Findlay, that was a completely no profile case. No one ever talked about it. There was a young man who was in his, he's young to me now. At that time, he seemed just an average guy. He was like 35 years old. He had 4 kids, as I recall. And he was charged with poaching a deer out of season. Now, he lived on 40 acres out in the county, and he was entirely self-sustaining, had a 20-acre garden, raised a few chickens, and was sort of anti-government in the sense that he would take no aid from anyone for any purpose. And he's got this wife, 4 kids, and himself, and he took this deer out of season, which they caught him with. And they filed charges against him, and they wanted to have me put him in jail for 30 days, take away his pickup truck, which was like 14 years old with 140,000 miles on it, take away his gun, and then deny him hunting privileges for as long as the statute would allow. And I sat there and I looked at it and I thought, yeah, this is crazy. I said, the only people who are really going to suffer if we do this are his children, right? While I certainly agree that poaching is a terrible crime, I think that not all poachers are created equally. So I fined this guy $25, and the prosecutor was brand new. He was just out of law school, maybe less than a year. The agent who made the arrest was out of, agent school for less than a year. They're just young kids. And I wasn't much older. I mean, I was probably 35 years old. And I just brought him into my chambers. I said, listen, guys, you got to use your brains. I said, what you're doing here is foolish. If I do what you want me to do, I'm going to cause a lot of pain, and the state is not going to be any better off. And by the way, these deer are starving to death this year. Right? I mean, they were in there so thick in the county that literally there were deer eating the hay from haystacks, and the farmers were complaining, and deer were starving to death. And I thought, we have to use a little common sense here. And I explained that to him, and I kind of thought it was all going to stay secret, but all the police officers thought it was very funny. So the next thing I know, everyone in the state is talking about this case, but within the legal community. So.
I heard from a federal marshal.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it made its way all the way through that channel. All right, last question about the state system. For those who are not familiar, and I know that most of our viewers are going to be in the legal community, for those who are not, North Dakota has a somewhat unusual state court of appeals, and I know you've sat at that level at various times. Can you just very briefly explain how that works, and how does your preparation approach to that differ from your day job, if you will, as a trial judge?
Well, the State Court of Appeals in North Dakota is a temporary court. It only comes into being when certain statutory criteria have been met, and it's only been called into existence 2 or 3 times during the history of the state. When I was a district court judge, it was called into existence, and we sat and for the better part of a week and heard, 20 or 25 cases that were mostly workers' comp cases and divorces. But the way it worked is I was appointed by the Chief Justice of the North Dakota Supreme Court, and we went down there and heard cases in 3 judge panels. And so that's that story.
Let's move on to the federal system. So in 2002, Judge Webb takes senior status, and you were nominated by President Bush as his replacement for the federal district court. How did your name come about for that? Do you know?
Well, it came about because I filled out an application and posted it on the website that the White House had. We were in a very odd situation where we had no member of Congress who was a member of the Republican Party. And so what the White House was doing in that situation was that they had a transition team that they had put together in 2000, and they kept it together, and they just said, post your resume. So I posted my resume and sent letters to Governor Hoeven at that time, and the members of the North Dakota Bush transition team, and said I was very interested in the job. And that's kind of where it started.
Okay. So during that confirmation process, any particular stories, unusual circumstances? What do you remember from your confirmation in 2002 and 2003?
Well, there were a lot of really capable people, most of whom were better qualified and more experienced than me. The bottom line is that I remember I sat down with Bob Chrisman, and he said to me, he says, the first thing you got to do is organize your national contacts. And I looked at him like he had two heads. I said, what, national contacts? I don't have any national contacts. And he just shook his head and he said, Ralph, I know the people you know. You have national contacts. You're just not thinking about who those contacts are. And so he helped me put together a list of people to contact, mostly people who knew people, or a handful of senators that I had met in passing and that I had had a single conversation with, but I would never have said they were friends of mine. With Bob's help, we put together a list and started working on them. And by the time it all was over, I had like 14 senators that had contacted the White House and asked that my name be given serious consideration. The oddest one was, at one point, I'm talking to my brother John, who's my youngest brother, and he has a best friend. His name was Franklin. And so John says, Frankie wants to know if he should talk to his cousin Teddy for you. And I said, who is his cousin Teddy? And he says, Teddy Kennedy. I said, what? He says, yeah, Frank's mom is a Kennedy cousin. I said, what? And I said, I'd be really happy if you went and talked to Teddy. And so I didn't really think there was anything to this. It seemed like pretty far-fetched for a kid from Rugby Frankie's from Rugby, right? And I've known Frankie since he was 4 years old. I mean, who knew? But anyhow, what happens is that a couple weeks later, I get a call from inside the White House, and they're a little suspicious. And they say, how do you know Ted Kennedy? And I said, I don't know Ted Kennedy, but my brother John's best friend is a cousin of Ted Kennedy's. They said, oh, well, that kind of explains it. And so I don't know what Ted Kennedy did or didn't do, but he obviously contacted someone in the White House, and it was a forceful enough "that's who we want" thing that they were suspicious of me. So whether that was any help or not, I'm not sure, but it was interesting.
You served on the district court bench for 14 years.
Yes.
So what are the few of the most important or memorable cases during that time on the federal district court?
I dealt with a lot of drug cases, and in a lot of ways, they're the most important cases when they were first offender drug offenses, when the mandatory minimums were either non-existent or short enough where we could still make a difference in their lives. And to me, those cases were important because they were people that we had an opportunity to make their lives better. The highest profile cases, I would say that there probably were three that nationally were quite prominent. The first is the United States versus Alfonso Rodriguez, which was the first death penalty trial tried in North Dakota for 100 years. And so that was also the longest trial that I tried. It started on July 6th and it ended on 23rd of September. And so there's that case. And then in addition to that, I had a Waters of the United States claim against where I think 11 states and state agencies from mostly the West had sued the EPA about the Waters of the United States regulations amendments. And then I had a Consumer Finance Protection Bureau case that was fairly prominent as well.
This might sound like an unusual question to ask of a district judge, because this is at least those of us who teach this material, we tend to talk about this in terms of appellate and Supreme Court judges, but this whole notion of a judicial philosophy. Is there such a thing as a judicial philosophy for a trial judge?
Yeah.
And did you have one
Yeah.
during that time?
Yeah, I think that all judges have a philosophy. And if you were to ask me, well, how did I see my judicial philosophy as a trial judge and how do I see it today, there's not really a great deal of difference. The first thing, as a trial judge, I would have described myself as a originalist and a textualist, right? And so those terms have pretty standard meaning, but for those who are not lawyers, just really what I wanted to do is I wanted to read the words and interpret them for what they actually say as they would have been viewed by the people who originally wrote and heard those laws as they were first announced. Now, on top of that, as a district judge, you kind of have a layer you also have a courtroom to manage, and you want to make that courtroom as accessible as possible. You want to make it comfortable, but you don't want to make it like the set of The Tonight Show or something, right? I mean, you want it to be a place where people can laugh, but they understand that what we're about is the serious business of judging conduct, right? That's another part of my philosophy. I wanted to make sure that everyone in that courtroom understood that we don't judge people in courts. We judge their conduct, right? And we should hold all people in great respect. And my philosophy, pretty simple. Didn't matter whether you lived under a bridge or you were the president of the United States, you were just somebody who was a person entitled to justice in my courtroom. And I was going to try my best every day to make sure that justice was done to the best of my ability.
So you talked a little bit about the various roles you held at the state level. We talked already about the fact that we think you're the only person in the history of North Dakota to be a county judge and a district judge and a Court of Appeals judge. And you also sat by designation on the state Supreme Court a couple of times. You've had a pretty varied career even at the federal level, even when you were still, if you can forgive me for using that phrase, a district court judge. You sat on a couple of other types of federal courts by designation or by special assignment. And so you want to talk a little about the bankruptcy court and the appeals courts by designation, and how do you juggle all that?
Well, I love the law and I love courts. And for me, it never seemed like work. Now, I think that there were moments where I said, yeah, I'll do that. And I added a bunch of work in my chambers. And my law clerks might have told you that, hey, Judge, we're just moving way too many directions, way too fast. But for me, it seemed manageable. I mean, and I always got my work out on time and I thought it was done well. I did bankruptcy work because Judge Hill had two brothers that practiced law in North Dakota, and they had an occasional bankruptcy practice. Tim Hill had a significant bankruptcy practice, so I handled all those cases. So whenever there was a conflict, I was the bankruptcy judge. I sat with the Ninth Circuit and the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals by designation. I thought that, and I tried to sit at least once a year every year because it was a good opportunity for my law clerks to get to know what that appellate system looked like. And so there were times when I said, man, I'm busy enough, I don't need this. But I always said yes, because I really felt that it was such a good experience for my law clerks that they needed to have that opportunity, or they would benefit from that opportunity. Sure. And when you talked about the courts, I do have this sort of weird thing where I've sat with every single court that has jurisdiction in North Dakota except the Supreme Court of the United States. And that is never happening. So, I doubt anyone else is ever going to have that experience because it's relatively rare anywhere.
Sure. So let's fast forward to 2017. There's an opening on the Eighth Circuit, and President Trump nominated you to that position. You'd already been through that nomination and confirmation process once at the district court level back in 2003. So what was different this time around?
There were a couple of differences. The first difference is that people care a lot more about circuit judges, and so the investigation is fairly similar, but the hearing process and the interrogation process is a lot more in-depth and a lot more confrontational. The second thing is that the climate in Washington had changed dramatically between 2002 and 2003, and then 2017. I mean, it had just been a sea change. I mean, the first time I went through, I was a non-controversial figure. I was, confirmed unanimously, and there wasn't a lot of chatter talk, and my hearing was very short. For the circuit court spot. My hearing went on for a couple of hours. There were a lot of I thought a lot more pointed questioning and a lot more partisan questioning. And yet at the end, I got unanimous support out of the Judiciary Committee and only one no vote on the floor of the Senate. So I was still non-controversial, but the climate has changed, and it is a much more difficult process now. When I got through the first time, I said I'd never do this again. And I will tell you that I'm never doing this again. Not that it ever would happen, but the process is hard.
So you've had a few years now on the appellate court, and I know that sometime in the future you'll likely do another one of these interviews to reflect back on that part of your career. But just real quickly, what's changed? Were there any surprises, unexpected things making that transition from trial court to the appellate court? Was there anything that said, I didn't expect that?
I had worked in trial courts for so long, and I had sat as a trial judge in so many different parts of the country, because that's one of the great beauties about being a federal judge is you can get assigned outside of your district. So I've tried cases in Minnesota and Nebraska and Florida, and as you go through that process, you see different lawyer communities, different courtroom cultures, but that judge is always the same, right? And so the way that I manage my courtroom is the way I manage my courtroom. Now, when I first went to the circuit bench and I started reading the transcripts of what other judges did, I really regret that, we didn't have access to everybody else's transcripts, and if we did, we didn't have time to read them, because there's a lot of things that judges are doing that in different parts of the country that are just different. And so the kind of things that happen in our courts in Missouri and Arkansas are just different than what happens in the Dakotas and Minnesota. And being able to read all of these different judges and all of their ways of running their courtrooms, I'd be a much better trial judge today than I was.
If you were to talk to law students or young attorneys or even new judges, someone just coming into the profession or coming into a new role within the profession, what sort of advice would you give them?
I think I'd start actually with talking to kids that are thinking about being lawyers, right? One of the things about the law is it tends to be a place where people go when they're not sure what else they want to do, right? And it happens because, any undergraduate degree will work. If you can take the test and pass the test and your grades are good enough, you can get into a law school. It buys you 3 more years to think about life. And everybody tells you, well, it's a great, general, broad, liberal education that will help you in any business endeavor that you may choose anyhow. So you're not really out anything by going to law school. There was a time when that may have been true, but now with the kind of debt that people incur in law school, I don't think that's really law school's not a good place to find yourself, right? And I think that as you think about why you'd want to be a lawyer, I think it really, for me, it's pretty straightforward. You want to be a lawyer because you want to help people and you want to make the world a better place, right? Because the law is a place where really a lot of things in the culture come into fruition. It's the place where sort of politics becomes reality in people's lives, right? And I don't mean that in sort of the, Republican Democrat. It's about the body politic and how do we hold the society together, right? And those things ought to interest you, right? One of my greatest frustrations when I look at young lawyers is that they tend not to want to think about the law as a system or think about justice as both a system of justice, but also as a desirable outcome. And so if we go about the business of applying the law without any notion at all as to how it fits into society or how the framework of the culture is built, we just are piling rules on top of rules and creating more problems than we solve. And so the first thing, I think that you shouldn't go into law unless you have some interest in doing that kind of work, at least if you're in the courtroom. And I speak mostly to courtroom lawyers because I've spent my whole life in a courtroom. Now, for young lawyers, I would say, here's the thing. Be honest with the court. Be honest with your client. Nobody is well served if your client walks into a courtroom and they think that there's no chance they're going to prison and the judge is thinking there is no chance you're walking out of here not doing 10 years, right? I mean, that's a recipe for disaster. And for established lawyers, I would say, let young lawyers get in the courtroom. We are so busy using alternative dispute resolution. We're so busy trying to avoid the courtroom that people are now afraid of being in there unless they work in the criminal area. And I think it's a big mistake. I think that without enough sort of cases to tell us how the system holds together, then all the times that you're going through arbitration, mediation, other alternative dispute resolutions, you're making decisions in the dark based on what you think people are likely to do rather than what they really do. So I would say quit being so afraid of being in court.
Given the current status of where we are in society, not just with the pandemic, but you talked a little bit earlier about polarization in politics. Where do you see the legal profession, particularly the practice of being a judge, going?
Technology changes everything. The practice of law was changed by the invention of the printing press in just untold ways, right? Not the least of which, for the first time, lawyers and judges were able to know what the law is because it was printed and put in books. The new technology allows us access to all kinds of information that we never had 10 years ago. The problem is it's not really very reliable information by and large. And so I think that for courts to do their work, there's a couple of prerequisites that we have to find a way to preserve in a culture. The first one is there has to be such a thing as objective truth. Right? Because if the facts are subject to being manipulated and changed at will by anybody, then there can be no law. Our entire legal system is based on the theory that we find the facts and then we apply the law to those facts. But if the facts are, in a constant state of flux and cannot be found, then we can't apply the law. And so we're going to have to figure out a way to say, how do we find objective truth in our courtrooms in a culture that seems to be walking away from truth, right? And that's hard. The other thing is we're going to have to make this process friendlier to jurors, right? I mean, the days when we can just say, hey, here's what we're going to do. We're going to bring you in here to talk about some drug dealer cases, and we're going to keep you here for 3 weeks. Those are gone. And so we need to figure out, how do we try cases more efficiently? How do we do it in a way that remains accessible to the jurors? And how do we convince the jurors that there is such a thing as truth? And these are going to be challenges for us. The other thing is, as judges, we're going to have to figure out, how do you deal with the polarized political community over the next short term for sure, and it may be 20 or 30 years. And if we get to the point where we see people as Republican judges or Democrat judges or, Bush judges or Trump judges or Obama judges, and that's how we see them all the time, and that's how the judges act, the wheels are going to fall off the one-horse shay. So I think it's really important that we find a way to put ourselves above the fray, embrace the concept that there is something that is truth so that facts can be found, and then fairly apply the law without regard to personal preferences or persons.
So last question. Anything you'd like to add? Anything we didn't talk about that you would have expected me to ask about? Or any additional thoughts or comments?
Not really, but I would like to just say that, as people look at judges, there's a tendency to see the judge as very different than the judge is. The judge is a lawyer. The judge is a person. The judge has the same sort of emotional draws, pulls, resistances that lawyers have. And it's just really important for the judge to understand that just because you got the robe, that doesn't mean that you got smarter. And it's also important to understand as a lawyer that judge is struggling oftentimes just like the lawyers are, and that really what everybody in that courtroom is looking for is a little guidance and a little help. And each of us have a role to play, and it's just important to do it to the best of our ability. Now, the only thing you didn't ask me about that I would have probably anticipated is, I was the judge of the first juvenile drug court in southeastern North Dakota, and only the second one in the state, and the first one beat me by a week. So really, we were the first two judges. And I will just tell you that that nothing in my life has been more rewarding than working with these addicted kids. It's been really, it was a very positive experience, and it continues to be, because I get Christmas cards from them where they tell me about their children and about their lives, and it's to me, it says an awful lot about judges, particularly at the trial level, where you can really reach out and make people's lives better.
Thanks very much for your time. Again, with U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals Judge Ralph Erickson for the 8th Circuit. Thanks for watching.
Thanks, Mark.